Hello everyone. Before we begin today's dramatic story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into today's story. A man hires a wife to solve his problems. But what happens next? You won't believe it. Let's see how this marriage of convenience turns into something unexpected. It was an ordinary evening in the quiet town of Brookville, but inside a cozy cafe, one man's life was about to change forever. A man in his late 30s, Mark Davis, sat in the corner booth, his fingers nervously drumming on the table. His eyes were focused on his phone screen, reading through emails about his financial struggles, his failing business, and the mounting pressure to keep everything afloat. Mark had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, but now, with the weight of the world on his shoulders, he was desperate. The reality of his situation was overwhelming. Debt collectors were calling. His company was on the verge of collapse, and he had no clear way out. Just as he was about to sink deeper into his thoughts, the door to the cafe opened, and a woman entered. She was dressed in a business suit, her heels clicking sharply on the floor as she scanned the room. Mark's eyes met hers for a brief moment, but she quickly looked away and walked past him, heading to the counter to place her order. She was elegant, confident, but there was a sadness behind her eyes, something Mark couldn't quite place. A few moments later, the woman returned to the booth beside him, sitting down with a soft sigh. Mark couldn't help but notice how exhausted she seemed. She looked like someone who had everything but was carrying a heavy burden, much like him. Their eyes met again, and this time, she smiled faintly, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mark felt an odd pull toward her, as if fate had brought them together in this small, quiet cafe for a reason. He hesitated for a moment before speaking up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a little more nervous than he intended. "I know this might sound strange, but I'm in a bit of a bind. Would you be willing to consider an unusual offer?" The woman raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "What kind of offer?" she asked, her tone calm, yet curious. Mark took a deep breath. This was it. His last chance. He had nothing to lose. "I need a wife," he said, his words tumbling out. "For a contract. It's not about love or romance, but rather a way to secure my business, to fix my financial situation. If you're willing, I'd offer you a generous sum in exchange for being my wife for a year. It's strictly business, no emotional attachment." The woman stared at him for a moment, processing his words. The silence between them stretched on, and Mark could see her mind working, weighing the decision in her head. After a long pause, she spoke. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice skeptical but intrigued. Mark nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I'm serious. I need help, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping on the table as she considered the offer. Mark could feel the tension in the air, the weight of his desperation hanging between them. Finally, she sighed. "All right," she said, surprising him. "I'll do it. But on one condition, you keep your end of the deal. No strings attached, no emotional manipulation. I'll help you, but don't expect anything more from me." Mark's heart raced as he processed her words. He couldn't believe it. She was agreeing to his offer. This woman, a complete stranger, was going to help him save everything he had worked for. "Deal," he said, his voice steady. "We'll keep it professional." And just like that, a contract was made. They exchanged the necessary details and agreed to meet again the following day to finalize everything. Mark's mind raced as he left the cafe that evening, his thoughts spinning with possibilities. This wasn't the solution he had imagined, but it was a solution nonetheless. What he didn't know was that this decision, this contract, would soon lead him down a path that he never could have predicted, one that would change both of their lives forever. And so Mark's knew. Life began. A life where a fake marriage was about to become very real. The next day, Mark arrived at the cafe, his heart pounding with anticipation. The agreement had been made, and he couldn't believe how quickly everything had fallen into place. The woman, whose name was Clara, had been surprisingly calm when she agreed to the deal. It was as if she had been waiting for an opportunity like this. Mark sat at the same booth where they had met the night before, waiting for her to arrive. He was anxious, but also relieved. He had taken the first step, and now, there was no turning back. He looked down at his phone and read through the contract they had drawn up. Nothing too complicated. A simple arrangement. 1 year of marriage. A promise of financial stability in exchange for her presence by his side. He had promised her no strings attached, and that was exactly what he intended to deliver. The door to the cafe swung open, and Clara walked in. She was just as poised and composed as she had been the night before, though today, there was a sense of quiet determination in her eyes. She spotted him immediately and made her way over to the booth, her heels clicking softly on the floor. When she sat down, she gave him a nod of acknowledgement, and without wasting time, she spoke. "I've read through the contract," Clara said, her voice steady and calm. "I have a few questions, but I'm ready to proceed." Mark looked at her, surprised by her level-headedness. "I thought you might have second thoughts by now," he admitted, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Clara smiled faintly. "I'm not one to make rash decisions. But this is my only option right now." She paused, her gaze drifting for a moment. "And I'm not doing this for free." Mark nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Of course. We'll keep everything professional. I promise." Clara leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the terms of the contract. "I want to make one thing clear," she said slowly. "We're not going to pretend this is something it's not. I'm not looking for romance, and I don't expect any emotional attachment. But we're going to have to work together as if this is a real marriage. That means public appearances, events, and all the things that come with being a married couple. I won't back out halfway." Mark's heart skipped a beat as he processed her words. She was serious about this, but so was he. He had no other choice, and now, he was committed to seeing this through. He had promised her no strings attached, and he would keep that promise. "I understand," he said, his voice firm now. "I'm in this for the long haul too. Let's get this done." Clara nodded, and they shook hands to seal their agreement. For a moment, the reality of what they had just agreed to hit Mark like a ton of bricks. He was going to marry a woman he barely knew, and for all intents and purposes, it was going to be a business arrangement. But as he looked at Clara, something in the back of his mind told him this wasn't going to be as simple as he had initially thought. They both stood up, and as they walked to the counter to finalize the details, Mark couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, he felt like he had a plan. This might be unconventional, but it was a plan. He was taking control of his life again. As they exchanged contact information and agreed on the next steps, Mark realized how much he was about to change his life. He wasn't sure where this arrangement would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't afford to back out now. "Let's meet tomorrow to sign the official documents," Clara said as they walked toward the door. Mark nodded, feeling a bit of weight lift off his shoulders. Tomorrow, then. And just like that, their new life together began. A life that was meant to be nothing more than a contract, but which, deep down, both of them knew could turn into something much more complicated than either of them could have ever imagined. The following morning, Mark stood outside the small law office with a stack of documents in his hands. His palms were damp, and his heartbeat echoed in his ears. This was really happening. He was about to sign a marriage contract with a woman he had met less than 48 hours ago. The cool morning air brushed against his face as he took a deep breath and pushed open the glass door. Inside, Clara was already there, seated at the long conference table with her posture straight and her expression unreadable. She had chosen a simple navy dress today, one that made her look both professional and impossibly composed, like someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Mark wished he could say the same about himself. When she looked up and saw him, she gave him a small nod, and he could tell she was ready to proceed. The lawyer, an older man with gray hair and glasses slipping down his nose, cleared his throat and began reviewing the terms. Every sentence he read sounded more surreal than the last. "This agreement outlines the marriage duration of 1 year. Both parties agree to appear as a married couple at public events when required. Neither party is obligated to maintain emotional or physical intimacy. Financial compensation will be provided monthly." Mark felt a wave of unease swell in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. He had no room for hesitation now. His business depended on this. His future depended on this. The lawyer slid the papers across the table, first to Clara. Without hesitation, she signed. Her hand did not shake. Her signature was clean, sharp, confident. Then the pen was passed to Mark. He stared at the lines for a moment longer than he intended to. His entire life had been built on principles and honesty. Yet here he was, entering a marriage for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Still, Clara's calm presence beside him gave him a strange sense of reassurance. She had her reasons too. Perhaps they were not so different after all. Mark signed. The final stroke of the pen felt like a door closing behind him. When he looked up, Clara was watching him with an expression he could not decipher. Not cold, not warm, just aware. That is it, the lawyer announced, stacking the papers neatly. You are now legally married. Legally married. The words hit Mark harder than he expected. Clara stood, smoothing her dress with graceful fingers. We should go over the first event, she said. Your company gala is next week. If we are going to appear together, we need to prepare. Outfits, introductions, how we speak to each other. Everything needs to look natural. Mark nodded. Right. We should plan. All of that. I want to make sure you are comfortable. Clara's eyes softened just slightly. Comfort is not the priority. Believability is. As they stepped outside, the sunlight hit them both. Mark blinked against the brightness, while Clara seemed unaffected, already focused on the next step. A married couple walking down the sidewalk. If anyone saw them, they would look ordinary. Normal. Like a pair that had chosen each other willingly. The irony tugged at Mark's chest. They walked toward the parking lot together. For a moment, they stood in silence. Then Clara spoke quietly, almost too quietly for him to hear. Thank you for keeping this professional. Mark turned to her. I keep my word. Clara gave a small nod, as if she had expected nothing less. Then we will be fine. She opened the door to her car, but paused before getting in. 1 year. No complications. No expectations. Mark repeated her words softly, more to himself than to her. No complications. No expectations. She got in, started the engine, and drove away. Mark stood there watching her car disappear down the road, feeling a strange heaviness settle in his chest. He had done everything right. Everything necessary. So why did it feel like he had just stepped into something far bigger than he could control? As the wind brushed past him, he realized one simple truth. This marriage might have begun as a contract, but nothing about what he felt now was simple at all. And deep down, something told him this was only the beginning. The gala was held at an upscale hotel downtown, its grand ballroom adorned with sparkling chandeliers and soft, golden lighting that made everything feel like it was bathed in warmth. Mark stood by the entrance, adjusting his cufflinks as he surveyed the crowd. It was everything he had expected, elegant, polished, and full of people who lived in a world far removed from his. His heart beat a little faster as he thought about Clara. This was their first public appearance as a married couple, and he knew they had to get it right. He couldn't afford any slip-ups. Clara had arrived separately, but Mark was already aware of her presence the moment she stepped into the room. She looked effortless, her dark hair pulled back into an elegant updo, wearing a deep red gown that clung to her. Figure like it had been tailored just for her. The moment their eyes met, she gave him a small nod, signaling she was ready. Mark walked toward her, and as he approached, he felt the weight of the event pressing down on him. He had rehearsed the introductions, the way they would act in front of others, but now that he was standing here, it all felt so surreal. As Clara reached him, she flashed a smile that was both polite and distant. Ready? She asked, her voice steady and controlled. As ready as I'll ever be, Mark replied, offering her his arm. She took it without hesitation, and together they made their way deeper into the ballroom. The eyes of the room followed them, whispers circulating as people speculated about the new couple. Mark could feel the tension in the air, but Clara remained composed, walking beside him with a confidence that was almost unnerving. When they reached the center of the room, the host of the event, a well-known businessman in the city, approached them. Mark, Clara, he said warmly, extending his hand. It's a pleasure to finally meet you both. I've heard so much about your business partnership. The words were casual, but the way he said business partnership made it clear he knew exactly what was going on. Mark forced a smile, extending his hand. It's a pleasure to meet you as well. Clara spoke up next, her voice smooth and confident. Thank you for inviting us. It's been a lovely evening so far. The conversation continued, each exchange polite but curt, the air between them thick with the unsaid. As they mingled, Mark couldn't help but notice the way people looked at Clara. She was graceful, composed, and every word she spoke seemed to carry weight. It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable. It was the way she seemed to fit in effortlessly with this world of wealth and power. And yet, despite the ease with which she moved through this crowd, there was something about her that made Mark uneasy. He couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but he sensed that Clara was playing a role. She was hiding something. It wasn't until later in the evening, when they found a quieter corner of the ballroom to speak, that Clara finally let her guard down, just a little. "You did well tonight," she said, her tone softer than it had been all evening. "I know it's not easy, but you handled yourself like a pro." Mark smiled, though he could still feel the tension in his shoulders. "Thanks. You too. It wasn't exactly what I was expecting." Clara nodded, her expression thoughtful. "None of this is what either of us expected." There was a pause, and Mark found himself looking at her, really looking at her for the first time. She wasn't just a stranger he had made a deal with. There was depth to her, something that went beyond the cold professionalism she had shown up until now. "Clara," he began, hesitating. "Why did you agree to this? To the contract?" Clara's eyes flickered for a brief moment, as if she was debating whether to answer honestly. Finally, she sighed. "Because I needed a way out," she said quietly. "A way out of everything. And this is the best I could do. At least for now." Mark wasn't sure how to respond to that, but before he could say anything, Clara straightened up and gave him a small, calculated smile. "But like I said, no emotions. We keep this professional." Mark nodded, suddenly aware of the weight of the moment. The night was drawing to a close, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line, one he wasn't sure he could go back from. As they left the gala together, the cameras flashing as they walked out of the ballroom, Mark realized that this wasn't just a business arrangement anymore. It was something more complicated, something neither of them had anticipated. And as Clara looked up at him, her expression unreadable, Mark felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't expected to feel: doubt. The following week, Mark and Clara found themselves in yet another high-profile event, this time a charity auction at an exclusive downtown venue. Mark had hoped that the tension between them would subside with time, but it only seemed to grow. Each day, their interactions felt more like a performance than a marriage. They were constantly in the public eye, attending events together, posing for photos, and exchanging polite words with other guests. But when the lights dimmed and the cameras turned away, the silence between them grew louder. As they entered the venue, Mark couldn't help but notice the way Clara carried herself, effortlessly. Elegant, her poise unshaken, even in the most crowded and chaotic of settings. She was the picture of composure, the kind of woman who made it seem like she had everything under control. Mark, on the other hand, felt like he was just playing a part, pretending to be someone he wasn't. He wasn't used to this world of opulence and artificial smiles, and yet, every time they stepped into a room together, he had to remind himself that this was his life now. They walked side by side through the glittering ballroom, their every move observed by the guests around them. Mark found it increasingly difficult to distinguish the woman he had hired from the woman he was beginning to feel an attraction to. Was she just pretending, or was there something real between them that neither of them had admitted? The evening wore on, and eventually, the time came for the auction to begin. As the first lot was announced, Mark glanced at Clara, who was scanning the room with sharp eyes, her focus on the event rather than the people. She was always so composed, always so professional. But in that moment, as their eyes met briefly across the room, Mark saw a flicker of something he hadn't expected. For just a second, she looked vulnerable, almost out of place in the sea of people who were bidding on luxury items she had no interest in. Before he could say anything, the auctioneer moved on to the next lot, and Clara's expression shifted back to its usual calm. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something subtle, but undeniable. Later, as the event came to a close, Mark and Clara stood by the exit, preparing to leave. The evening had been a success in the eyes of the world, another flawless appearance as the perfect couple. But as Mark looked at Clara, something inside him stirred. He wanted to ask her about the moment he had seen in her eyes earlier, but he couldn't bring himself to. Instead, he cleared his throat and spoke, his voice careful. "You did great tonight," he said, trying to keep the conversation light. Clara gave him a small, polite smile. "Thank you," she replied. Her voice was the same as always, calm, measured, detached. And yet, for some reason, Mark felt like he was seeing her for the first time. He wanted to know more about her, to understand what lay beneath the carefully constructed exterior. But there was something in her that kept him at arm's length, a wall that she had built so high that even he couldn't see over it. As they stepped into the car together, the driver waiting to take them back to their respective lives, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of growing frustration. This marriage, this arrangement, it was supposed to be simple. But the more he got to know Clara, the more complicated everything seemed. The lines between fake and real were blurring, and Mark wasn't sure he could tell where one ended and the other began. As the car pulled away from the venue, Mark sat in silence, his thoughts swirling. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, a man who made decisions and stuck to them. But this situation, this marriage of convenience, was starting to feel like a decision he couldn't control. And as Clara sat beside him, her face unreadable in the dim light of the car, Mark realized that he was no longer sure who he was pretending for. Was it for the world around him, or was it for her? The next few days passed in a blur of business meetings, charity events, and the occasional private moment between Mark and Clara. Yet, no matter how many times they played the part of the perfect couple in front of others, something seemed to be growing between them, an unspoken connection neither of them had anticipated. Mark couldn't quite explain it, but every time they shared a glance, every time they spoke, there was a moment of vulnerability, a subtle crack in the walls they had both carefully built. Clara, as always, maintained her composed exterior. She was still the perfect professional, always calculating, always keeping her distance. But Mark had started to notice small things, things he wasn't sure how to interpret. The way she would look at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. The way her smile sometimes seemed more genuine than forced. He had been careful not to let his feelings cloud his judgment, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the chemistry between them. It wasn't until a quiet evening in the penthouse that Mark finally decided to address the growing tension between them. Clara was sitting by the window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her wine glass. The city lights stretched out before them, casting a soft glow across the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, but it carried an undercurrent of something more, something unspoken. Mark stood by the door, watching her for a moment before he cleared his throat and walked over to her. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "I need to know something." She looked up at him, her eyes unreadable. "What is it?" she asked, her tone cool but not dismissive. Mark hesitated, unsure of how to phrase the question. He didn't want to sound like he was accusing her of anything, but he had to know. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked. "Why did you agree to this marriage, this contract? You don't seem like the type to do something for money or convenience. So what's your real reason?" Clara didn't immediately answer. Instead, she took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving his. It felt like a lifetime before she finally spoke. "I told you before," she said quietly, "I needed a way out." Mark frowned. A way out of what? Clara set the glass down on the table, her fingers lingering on the rim for a moment before she looked away. "A way out of everything," she said softly. "Of the life I've been trapped in. Of the expectations, the obligations, the people who only care about what I can do for them." Mark's heart clenched as he listened to her. He had never imagined that Clara, someone so seemingly perfect, so self-assured, was carrying such a heavy burden. For a moment, the walls she had so carefully built around herself seemed to crumble. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weariness that no one else had ever noticed. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing, just standing there in the silence. After a long pause, Clara finally spoke again, her voice soft but resolute. "I know this was never supposed to be real. I know I agreed to this because it was practical. But somewhere along the way, I started to wonder if it could be more than that." Mark felt his pulse quicken at her words. "You think it could be more?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's gaze met his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I'm starting to feel something. Something I wasn't expecting. And that terrifies me." Mark took a step closer to her, his heart racing. "Clara, But before he could finish his sentence, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. Both of them stiffened, the spell broken. Clara quickly turned away, her expression shifting back to the cold, professional mask she wore so well. "We have to go," she said, her voice once again all business. Mark nodded. the weight of the conversation still hanging in the air between them. He wanted to say something more, but he didn't. They were both bound by the contract, bound by the expectations they had placed on each other. As they left the penthouse together, the moment they shared lingered in the back of Mark's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, and that things between them were about to change, whether they were ready for it or not. The car ride to the next event was quiet, the tension between Mark and Clara palpable in the air. They both sat on opposite sides of the back seat, lost in their own thoughts, the silence stretching longer than either of them had expected. Mark's mind replayed their conversation from the penthouse. Clara's admission that she was starting to feel something was still fresh in his mind. He hadn't imagined it. She had said it herself. But what did it mean? Could this arrangement, which had started as nothing more than a contract, really turn into something more? His thoughts were interrupted as the car pulled up to the venue, a luxurious gala celebrating a new business venture. The flashing lights from the cameras outside were blinding, and the noise of the crowd buzzed in the background. Mark glanced at Clara, whose mask had already returned. She looked every bit the polished professional, composed, perfect, detached. The woman he had been working with all along. As they stepped out of the car, the paparazzi surrounded them, snapping photos and calling out their names. Mark offered a smile, though it felt forced. Clara, on the other hand, handled it with ease, offering only the slightest of smiles as they walked arm toward the entrance. It was the act they had perfected over the past few weeks. Appearances were everything, after all. Inside, the atmosphere was just as extravagant as the outside. The ballroom was filled with business tycoons, celebrities, and socialites, all gathered to celebrate wealth, power, and influence. Mark felt out of place here, surrounded by people whose lives seemed so far removed from his own. But beside him, Clara was in her element. She moved through the crowd with grace, exchanging pleasantries with people who clearly admired her. Mark noticed the way they all seemed to defer to her, the subtle respect in their gestures. It was clear she was a force in this world, a world he was only just beginning to navigate. As the evening progressed, Mark's thoughts kept drifting back to their conversation. Clara had looked vulnerable for a brief moment, but now she was back to being the woman everyone expected her to be. Could he push her further, or had he already crossed a line by asking her about her true feelings? The night wore on, and Mark found himself growing more and more restless. The events, the conversations, the forced smiles, they all felt like a blur. It wasn't until the auction portion of the evening that he realized just how disconnected he felt. Clara had been talking to someone else when he had wandered off to grab a drink. As he stood by the bar, watching her from across the room, something tugged at him. She was laughing, genuinely, at something someone had said. For a moment, she seemed like a completely different person, one who wasn't bound by the contract, by the expectations of the world around her. She seemed free. Mark's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time since they had signed the agreement, he found himself unsure of what he was supposed to feel. Was this all just a game for her? Or was she, like him, starting to feel that the lines between the contract and reality were becoming harder to distinguish? He didn't have long to dwell on it. Clara made her way over to him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed him. "You look lost," she said, her voice light, but with a hint of something else beneath it. Mark gave a small smile, trying to push the unease aside. "Just thinking," he said, his voice low. Clara studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, stop thinking for now," she said, her tone softening. "It's just a party, Mark. Nothing more." Mark wanted to respond, to ask her what she really meant, but before he could, a man came over to congratulate them on their success. The conversation shifted, and just like that, the moment was gone. As the night wore on, Mark felt the growing distance between them. It was as though the walls they had carefully constructed had become too high to scale, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't reach her. At the end of the evening, they walked out together, their steps echoing in the empty parking lot. The world around them seemed so distant, and yet, when Clara turned to him, her eyes were soft, her expression unreadable. "Good night, Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark nodded, his throat tight with words he couldn't seem to find. As she turned away and got into her car, Mark stood there for a moment longer, watching her drive off into the night. He had thought he understood everything about this arrangement, but now, more than ever, he realized he had no idea what was happening between them. and that uncertainty gnawed at him more than he wanted to admit. The following morning, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that everything was shifting beneath him. The gala had been a blur, but the conversation with Clara lingered in his mind. He had spent the entire night trying to decode the emotions he saw in her eyes, trying to understand what was real and what was just part of the game they were playing. But with every passing hour, the lines between the two became blurrier. Was she starting to feel something for him, or was she simply caught up in the role she was forced to play? His thoughts were interrupted when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Clara. "We need to talk." Mark stared at the text for a moment, his heart racing. He hadn't expected this, not so soon. He had been wondering if the moment would come when one of them would finally admit the truth, but he wasn't prepared for it to happen like this. "Where?" He quickly typed back. A few seconds later, she replied, "My place, 6 p.m. Mark didn't waste time. He was at her apartment exactly at 6, his nerves on edge. As he knocked on her door, he wondered what kind of conversation they were about to have. He had a million questions, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the answers. Clara opened the door, her expression unreadable as always. She stepped aside to let him in, and Mark couldn't help but notice how distant she seemed, even though they were standing just a few feet apart. "We need to talk," Clara said, her voice steady but firm. Mark nodded, trying to steady his breathing. "About what?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. Clara motioned for him to sit on the couch. As Mark took a seat, she walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. "About this," she said softly. "About everything. About us." Mark's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, about us?" Clara turned to face him, her gaze unwavering. "I think it's clear by now that this isn't just a contract anymore. Neither of us signed up for this to be real, but somewhere along the way, it became something more. And I think we both know it." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had thought about it, of course. He had wondered if this was more than just a business arrangement, but he hadn't been ready to admit it. And now Clara was saying it aloud, making everything feel so much more complicated. "I don't know what to do with this," Clara continued, her voice softer now, tinged with something Mark couldn't quite place. "I never thought I'd feel this way. I never thought I'd care. But now, it's hard to pretend like nothing has changed." Mark's heart was pounding in his chest. "Clara, he didn't know what to say. His mind was racing, but all the words seemed to escape him. "I know," she interrupted, shaking her head slightly. "I don't want to complicate things. I don't want to ruin what we've built, what we agreed on. But I can't ignore how I'm feeling anymore." There it was, the truth, spilling out between them. Clara had always been so guarded, so composed, but now she was standing there, vulnerable, raw in a way he had never seen before. Mark didn't know what to do with it. Everything he had been holding inside for weeks, the doubts, the confusion, the desire, came rushing to the surface. He wanted to reach out, to say something that would make all of this make sense, but instead, he stayed silent, his eyes locked on hers. Clara took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for something. "I think it's time we decide what we're really doing here," she said. "We can't keep pretending that this is just a business deal. Not anymore." Mark's mind was spinning. Was this it? The turning point they had both been dancing around? He had never wanted a relationship, never thought he would find himself here. But with Clara standing in front of him, her walls down, he realized something. He wasn't pretending anymore. He didn't want to pretend anymore. "I agree," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "We can't keep pretending. But I need to know something first, Clara. Are we doing this because we're both feeling something? Or is it just because we're stuck in this contract?" Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the couch and sat next to him, close enough that Mark could feel the heat of her body beside his. She looked down at her hands, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her sleeve. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I think I'm starting to care more than I should." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Mark didn't know where to go from here, but for the first time in weeks, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. Maybe it was time to find out where this path would lead them, together. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty, each moment making Mark more and more aware of the growing connection between him and Clara. The lines between their contract and reality had blurred completely, and he found himself questioning everything: his decisions, his feelings, and, most of all, his future. But even as the doubts crept in, Something in him couldn't deny the pull he felt whenever Clara was near. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something real. He had never planned for this, but now, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to end. The night of their anniversary, an important milestone in the world they inhabited, Clara called him. The sound of her voice over the phone made his heart race. "Mark," she said, "can we talk tonight? I've been thinking about everything, and I don't want to keep pretending anymore." Mark's chest tightened. He had been expecting this conversation, but now that it was finally here, he wasn't sure what to say. Was this the moment when they would admit that they had crossed the line? That what had begun as a simple business arrangement had turned into something neither of them could control? "Of course," he replied, his voice steady despite the nerves building inside him. "I'll be there in an hour." An hour later, Mark stood in front of Clara's apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the way she had sounded on the phone told him everything had changed. This wasn't just about a business deal anymore. It was about them. He knocked on her door, and when she opened it, she smiled softly, a quiet warmth in her eyes that made his pulse quicken. She stepped aside to let him in, and as he entered the apartment, he felt the familiar tension between them. But this time, it felt different, lighter, more honest. Clara led him to the living room, where they sat together on the couch, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable but filled with anticipation. "Mark," Clara began, her voice quiet. "I've been trying to keep everything professional, but I can't anymore. I've been fighting this for so long, but the truth is, I care about you. I care about us, and I think I've known that for a while now." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had been hoping for this moment, but hearing the words out loud made it all feel so much more real. He didn't know what to say at first, but then he found the courage to speak. "I care about you too, Clara, more than I ever thought I would. And I don't want to hide behind this contract anymore. I want us to be real. No more pretending." Clara's eyes softened, and she reached out to take his hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice vulnerable. "Because this changes everything. We can't go back once we cross this line." Mark squeezed her hand gently, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm sure. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Clara's lips curled into a small, relieved smile, and for the first time in weeks, the weight on Mark's chest seemed to lift. He wasn't sure what the future held for them, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a contract anymore. This was real. Clara leaned in, her face inches from his, and for a moment, everything else faded away. There were no contracts, no expectations, just the two of them, ready to step into something new. She closed the distance between them and kissed him softly, a kiss that spoke of everything they had both been holding back. When they pulled apart, Clara rested her forehead against his, her eyes closing as if she was savoring the moment. "This is it, isn't it?" she whispered. "This is the start of something real." Mark smiled, his heart full. "Yeah, it is." They sat there together, the world outside their little bubble fading into the background. For the first time in a long time, Mark didn't feel lost or uncertain. He knew exactly what he wanted, and for the first time in his life, he was ready to take a chance on something that could change everything. Together, they had crossed the line, and together, they would see where it would lead them.